Hi, my name is Tammy Pettigrew. I am the Cannabis Cutie, and I'm here today to kind of tell you the story of 420, to kind of explain why we are so fascinated with this date and time, and why no matter what, if we're smoking alone at 420, we still feel that somewhere out there in the ether, someone is seshing with us, even if we can't see them. So there's a lot of theories that go around the story of 420 and why we celebrate that day and time. One theory is that there are 420 chemicals in the cannabis plant. Another theory is that it's Hitler's birthday. But really what I want to tell you is the true story, because there's even around the true story, there's still a lot of myths and legends. So I will start my presentation by sharing the screen if I can. It says it's disabled. Okay. All right. So the story of 420. So it all started in San Rafael County, the city in California. And if you look here on the map, it's up here in the Bay in Northern California, right outside of San Francisco and Oakland. And basically the Waldos were 5 guys who were friends in high school. They loved to laugh, they loved to have fun. But they had an access issue when it came to cannabis. So if you think about being a teenager today, getting your hands on cannabis is quite easy. You have so many different ways to even be discreet about it, with vape pens and edibles. So what these guys were trying to figure out was how could they get their hands on cannabis without being looked at as criminals and going to jail, because one of the Waldo's dad was actually on the police force in the narc division. So what they decided was that they would meet up every day at 420 to go search Point Reyes Forest for this abandoned cannabis field that was abandoned by a U.S. Coast Guardsman who had drawn out this map for them to go search. So the reason why they decided on the time 420 is because they would get out of school at 3 p.m. Practice for football would last about an hour. So they all decided to meet at 4:20 p.m. at this statue here on campus. It's the St. Louis Pasteur statue. So the original saying was actually 420 Louis. But they eventually got to a point where they started dropping the Louis and it just became 420. And that was kind of a way to keep it code so that parents wouldn't know what they were talking about, or maybe someone else in their hallway, so that nobody would go in and kind of try to take those plants that were free. Because the goal was to get to these plants, find them, and get some nugs so that they could have a good time. So Waldo Dave's brother, Pat, had actually been friends with the bass player, Phil Lesh, and to make the connection even deeper, their dad actually managed the band's real estate. So he would purchase property for the bands. And in 1975, Phil asked his longtime friend of decades to manage some of his side bands. So this kind of gave Waldo Dave's brother, Pat, some access to be backstage and to get to know people. And that's kind of where they would bring up their term that they created, the 420 code for using cannabis. So they would hang out backstage, they would smoke, and then the Deadheads are the fan base for the Grateful Dead. And the Grateful Dead actually started incorporating this term as code for consuming cannabis on stage. And it really was their fan base of the Grateful Dead that kind of spread this legend and created this cultural phenomenon that just started with a group of 5 friends who had no clue that this would become a cultural phenomenon. But it started to get popular in Marin County, where the Deadheads were kind of resident too. And then here I have a quote from Waldo Dave, who, again, he was the brother of Pat, who was connected with the Grateful Dead. And they always had a really good time. They said that those memories were precious. So there's a lot of validity proving that this story is true. We even here have a tie-dye flag that their friend Patty made in art class. And there's even documentation that this was made in the 70s, back in their art class. And you can see here on the flag, they have the 420 with the marijuana leaf in the background as an ode to it. And even further proof, Patty had a letter that she wrote to one of the Waldos asking about how their 420 is going. And the same thing, one of the Waldos wrote another Waldo a letter in college that also proves the 420. And if you're looking for further proof that this is the origin of the story, that they are the creators of 420, their website has a lot of interesting information, and they kind of clear up what a lot of blogs and other information sites get wrong about their story. And then finally, the U.S. Coast Guardman that made the map is here in the center. They got in contact with him in 1960s, and they he confirmed that he drew the map, but I will say that they never found the field. But it was just a very interesting story. And then another ironic thing that happened, unfortunately, Pat died, the one that was working with the Grateful Dead, but his time of passing was on December 20th, 2018 at 4:20 p.m. So I thought that that was kind of beautiful that it went full circle. And then as far as legacy goes, Lagunitas made a beer as an ode to their place in pop culture and what they did for 420. It's the dankiest and hoppiest beer ever brewed at Lagunitas. That site actually has a really cool story behind it all. And then fun fact, I know this doesn't have to do with 420, but there are terpenes in the cannabis plant that it's called humulene that's actually found in hops. And hops and cannabis are actually related in the plant kingdom. They are in the same family. They have the same distant relatives. So that's even a fun fact that the 420 guys got their own special ale. So if you liked what I talked about here, you can follow me on Instagram. I have my information on the next slide. Ooh, it disappeared. Sharing is paused. Oh, it just popped up. Sorry. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed that story of 420. I know it wasn't super long. It really is a quick story, but I just thought it would be great for people who celebrate at 420 or on 420 to know this information. I know the cannabis community was extremely excited about having an entire month dedicated to 420 since we only get this every 100 years, but we've adjusted. I think Urbana is doing something great by still having an interactive weekend so that we can kind of sesh and celebrate together, even though we're not able to be at all the festivals and cups. Do you have any questions for me? What are you smoking today? I am smoking on Banana OG. It's been one of my favorite strains. It smells super, super stinky and skunky. That's how I like my cannabis. Usually, if it's sweet, it puts me to sleep. That's kind of how I've learned. So the skunkier, the better. How did I learn all of this? I learned all of this. I just love to read. I've actually taken a lot of cannabis courses. I'm also developing my own that's just basic knowledge. And then also learning the story of 420 was just naturally a progression of wanting to know all things cannabis. I think cultural information is just as important. And do I recommend any edibles? You know, I really do like these Shuggies, little sugar and honey packets that I put into my tea. Another edible that I really like is La Familia has these churro Rice Krispies that I cannot get enough of. If I could devour the whole bag, I would, but I have children, so I just do what I can. What made you get into the education portion of cannabis? Well, for me, I had been using cannabis for 10 or 11 years, but I grew up in the South where if you were considered a cannabis user, it's pretty much the equivalent as being a heroin user. And I just didn't want that stigma to surround me. Um, when I started to learn the science of cannabis, that's when I knew that the general public needed to understand what was going on and to really accept that you weren't doing anything other than medicating and attuning your endocannabinoid system, and that there shouldn't be a stigma around it and you shouldn't feel bad. So that's part of my mission. Is there any books about cannabis that are good stories to learn? One of my absolute favorite books that I love to read is a cannabis history book. It is a memoir of a pioneer, and that is written by Alice O'Leary Randall. She is the wife of, or the widow of Robert Randall. He was the first cannabis patient in the United States. He actually was receiving his cannabis in the 70s from the federal government. That book really does document how we got from a totally legal and accepted plant with no medical controversy to going to political controversial and being wiped out. And then they talk about their role in it. And it's quite interesting to learn how we got to Schedule 1, the Tax Act, the Controlled Substances Act, and all of that information. How long have you been in the cannabis industry? 2017 is when I went to grad school, or 2016 is when I went to grad school with the intent on entering the cannabis space. It was 2018 is when I decided that I wanted to educate for the cannabis community on social media. And it was really successful, the launch of that, just because there's such a need for people to kind of understand the inner workings of the plant, the stigma surrounding it, and really just getting rid of the myths. And those are really great questions. Thank you. Any other questions? And I'll just say, for a fun fact, I really do like consuming indicas. Sativas put me to sleep. So that sativa gives you energy thing is also a myth, if you didn't know.
That's funny. I feel the opposite way.
Yeah, it just really depends on the person. So I try to stay away from telling people, oh, if you want energy, go to sativa, because for me, it's going to be me on the couch laughing and watching TV and probably taking a nap.
Yeah, exactly. Looks like we have another question.
Okay. Do you know anything about the Compassionate Care Act and new changes? Is that the one where you're allowed to donate cannabis again under Prop 64? Yeah, so that would be the Brownie-Mary Act. So back before we got to the Prop 64, under 215, you were allowed to donate cannabis to people who couldn't afford it. So you're talking veterans, you're talking AIDS and HIV patients. And under Prop 64, they completely made that illegal, which definitely harms so many protected classes in our nation, especially in California. I mean, if you think about all the veterans that are homeless or don't have access to cannabis, this really is detrimental, especially with PTSD being a endocannabinoid deficiency disorder, which just means that your body has a low level circulation of natural cannabinoids. And so using the plant to kind of mitigate that is ideal. So passing the Compassionate Care Act is a huge win for patients who don't have access, and it gives them a way to get legal, clean cannabis from the legal side of the market, and we can donate as consumers, as dispensary owners. I think it's a huge change that we needed for the cannabis industry.
Well, great. Thank you so much for sharing the history of 420. That was so interesting. Everyone be sure to follow her on Instagram, the Cannabis Cutie. And thank you.
Thank you for having me. I hope the rest of your 420 festivities are great, and make sure you're catching all the other events.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye.